Hello and welcome to this exclusive Patreon Q&A to celebrate getting 100 Patreons, although now I actually think it's on 101, so welcome to the new one. I got some wonderful questions here from you people, and I'm going to answer them. I've not done any research on these, I'm just answering off the top of my head. So let's start with Stephen Kelly. Do you think that musical ability can be taught, or do you have to be born with it? So I would say to this that everyone, at least in my experience as a teacher, can be taught a basic level of music ability. But the difficult thing with learning a musical instrument is finding the will to put in enough time to actually get any good at it. And ultimately that will has to come from you as an individual. So if you're somebody who's very self-motivated to learn this instrument, then you're going to learn the instrument. And if you're not self-motivated, then you're not going to learn it. I do think that some people are more naturally inclined to want to put that time in, want to put that practice in. And that's not saying that people who don't are lazy. I'm just saying that some people get a real kick out of practicing something and challenging themselves with a very monotonous task. And some people prefer to do something different with their time. But this idea that some people are born with a talent and some people aren't, that isn't the way I see it. I see that most people can learn a musical instrument to a pretty high level if they put the time in. So next question, David Defenderfer asks, any interesting use of polyrhythms in pop music or other music that you think is worth highlighting? So the first example that comes to mind for me is a Radiohead song called Daydreaming, where there's a counter rhythm between the two hands of the piano line. The left hand is playing in groups of two and the right hand is playing in groups of three. As far as polyrhythms go, that's a fairly straightforward one, 3 against 2, but it's really effective in the context of this song. It creates a sort of hypnotising effect. John Lasseter has left a few questions here. Firstly, did you study music theory and performance at university? I did study at university. I studied at a place called BIM, and there was various modules at BIM on performance and music theory, like you said. Without talking ill of BIM, the music theory course was fairly elementary. It didn't go particularly deep. It didn't go as deep as these videos, for example. My videos are definitely more advanced than the stuff we even did on the degree course at BIM. Performance is more where BIM's strength lies. So I did a few different performance modules and a few different theory modules. And the performance ones were actually really useful for me because it's an opportunity to get up in front of your peers and keep refining on a performance. So rather than just doing it once, you'll do it once, you talk about it, you do it again, and you can actually pin down ways to improve performance. Is there one book that you would recommend to someone who wants to learn music theory? I said before to people, I'm not a very booky musician. There certainly are a whole world of books out there that I'm sure are really useful, but I've largely learnt music theory through experience and through the internet. What was the first CD of pop music you ever owned? The very first CD I ever bought was actually a single of the song Laura by the Scissor Sisters. And then I think the first album I ever bought was Costello Music by the Fratellis. That may have surprised you based on the taste you may have thought I had based on the videos you've watched of mine. But I'll remind you that I did listen to music before I bought that very first CD. I actually had an MP3 player that exclusively had the works of the Beatles and their solo projects on it. So it had like 250 songs on, all of which were from the Beatles. Which leads me on actually to the last question, and lastly, John or Paul. Why would you ask that? That's such a difficult question. I think ultimately it has to go John Lennon. I think John Lennon wrote the most songs that I personally love. I also think that he was the more creative of the two. I think, and I'm not alone in thinking this, that Paul was the one who wrote the more accessible pop songs and John wrote the more edgy alternative songs. Like, try and think about the differences between Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. Those are two sides of the same single, and yet Penny Lane is really bright and happy and poppy, and Strawberry Fields Forever is a bit more weird and alternative. John and Paul were amazing songwriters, don't get me wrong, they were both absolutely sensational, but I think I do go slightly more into Team John than I do Team Paul. But let's not forget about George Harrison, he's amazing too. Okay, Jonathan Banks asks, do you have any advice for starting a music education YouTube channel on a low budget? So yes, I do have some advice. I would say that the biggest expense in starting a YouTube channel is the camera and the microphone. As a musician, you probably already have a microphone, so that's good. But also, don't forget to use it. A lot of YouTubers, when they start out, they just use the inbuilt sound on the camera and it sounds awful. So make sure you also have a microphone recording and you synchronize the two together. Cameras aren't cheap. If you already have one, that's great. If you don't, either try and find one that's affordable for you or try and borrow one. Because you do want the videos to look good. In the current YouTube world, everything is pristine and crisp and clear, so you can't really get away with an iPhone, really. Fritz van der Holst asks, your videos are mostly about different bands and musical styles throughout the 60s till now. Was your education on popular or light music, as it's generally called, or did you do classical music education? So I did a bit of both really, but predominantly I studied popular music. I started out learning classical music. I did an A-level, which is a 2-year qualification, and that was predominantly classical music, although it had some pop music in it. But then when I went to uni to do a degree, that was virtually 100% popular music. So that is where most of my strengths lie with analysing music. But I do play a lot of jazz, and I do have an awareness of classical music, but I'm definitely more in the world of pop and rock music. Sven Bornmark asks, in your videos you seem to be focusing on music made in the 60s and 70s. Would you agree that music from those years had more interesting harmonic content than music made after that? I think I do agree with that. I think that music from the late 60s through to the early 80s was particularly harmonically interesting. Bohemian Rhapsody being a #1 song. How could you possibly even compare that to anything that came out in the last 10 years? But I think it's a bit of a biased opinion. Not only is there the whole thing of looking back on the past with rose-tinted glasses on. So, you look back on the 70s and you think of the 100 most popular songs of the 70s, and you then unfairly compare that to the 10 songs that came out this week. But beyond that, I actually think the problem nowadays is that a lot of the interesting music is not in the mainstream. You're not hearing it on the radio anymore. If you think about Radiohead, for example, in the 90s they were potentially one of the most interesting bands on the radio, but when they released Kid A in the 2000s, they stopped being a radio band. They still continued innovating and making amazing music, but it's no longer on the radio. So what I think's actually happened over the last 20, 30 years is that the music on the radio has become more middle of the road and less risque. And that advanced music, advanced in terms of harmonics and technique, is still being made, but it's just not in those same avenues anymore. You have to look a bit deeper to find it. J.A. Kockensparger asks, when did you know that you were going to make a career in music? So I know when I decided that I wanted a career in music, it was when my band had just done a gig and it had gone really well. I was 17 at the time, and I just decided I really enjoy making music and I want to make this my full-time job. And that's when I decided to study music at university. But it wasn't until the second year of uni that I started actually making a little bit of money making music, and I realised that you can do this. You can cobble together different sources of revenue as a musician and turn it into a career. And it's ultimately a case of just thinking of all the skills you have as a musician, teaching, recording, writing, performing, and finding ways to monetize those. And this YouTube channel has been a particularly surprising one that has suddenly become quite a core part of my career. And to finish off, Laura Mitchell asks, who's your favourite band to play with? Well, of course, that would be the One Night Band, which is the band that you've probably seen in some of my gig vlogs. If you're getting married, then you know where to go. So thank you again for all of your support on Patreon. It genuinely, and I know I say this a lot, but it genuinely makes all of the difference in making this channel a feasible part of my career. Because if I couldn't make money from the channel, I just wouldn't be able to justify the amount of time that goes into each of these videos. So thank you so much for allowing me to do something that I love for my career. We're going to be having another Q&A on the main channel soon, if and when I get to 100,000 subscribers. So if you have any more questions that you want to put forward for that, then let me know, either down in the comments here or on one of my main channel videos. But thank you again for all of your support.